Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sabrina, and on behalf of Choice, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Fashion Media as Primary Source, Three Interdisciplinary Ways to Teach with Women's Wear Daily Visual Journalism, which is sponsored by Clarivate. This session is one in a series of sponsored webinars from Choice that addresses new ideas and developments of interest to the academic library community. I'll just put a couple links in the chat where you can register for upcoming webinars and watch previous webinar recordings. Before we get started, I'd like to point out just a few features of the webinar software. All attendees who join the presentation are automatically muted and your cameras are off, so don't worry about generating any noise or feedback. We've got that taken care of for you. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. To adjust the size of the slides or video, you can use the divider in the middle of the screen to slide the sizes to your liking. We are using the Q&A feature today. Please use it to submit questions or comments for our speakers. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation, so please do type your questions into the Q&A module as they occur to you. Also, there's closed captioning available for today's session. To toggle the automated captions on or off, please use the Show Captions button on the bottom panel of your screen. You can also turn on automated translation for the captions by clicking the arrow button, toggling on translation, and selecting your preferred language. Last, please note that we are recording today's program, and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with links to the recording and today's slides. And with that, we're ready to get started, so I will hand it over to Chris.
Thank you, Sabrina, and thank you to ACRL for hosting today's session. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Chris Cotton, Senior Manager for Product Management at Clarivate. I work across our literature, entertainment and popular culture, performing arts, and visual arts and design resources. I'm delighted to see so much interest in today's webinar, Fashion Media as Primary Source. Today's session focuses on how fashion media functions within teaching and research when it's used as primary source material. Trade publications like Women's Wear Daily provide sustained, contemporaneous coverage of creative work, industry decision-making, labour, commerce and representation. In academic settings, these materials support close analysis of how culture and industry have interacted over many decades. They're used across history, business, media studies, fashion studies, and many other programmes, and can connect textual inquiry with visual and material culture. Today we're focusing primarily on Women's Wear Daily and its role within fashion media scholarship, and we're very fortunate to be joined by Tonya Blazio Licorish, Archives Editor at Penske Media Corporation, where she works with Women's Wear Daily and other publications. She's also an author, visual culture historian, and educator. Tonya brings, therefore, a rare perspective bridging archival practice, scholarship, and teaching. She'll walk through how the Women's Wear Daily archive and related editorial collections can support cross-disciplinary analysis, research, and classroom use, drawing directly from her work with these materials. As Tonya presents, I encourage you to think about how fashion media is already showing up in your institution, and where these kinds of sources can support deeper engagement with primary source literacy, analysis of visual content, and historical inquiry. We will leave time at the end for questions and discussion, so please feel free to share questions in the chat as we go, and we'll return to those later in the session. With that, I'm very happy to turn things over to Tonya to begin our exploration of Women's Wear Daily and fashion media as primary source, and to talk through the first two of three example research paths that she'll share today. Tonya.
Hi, Chris. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for having me here. I'm really excited to present this to your audience and to, invite them into Women's Wear Daily's deep breadth of knowledge and coverage around the fashion industry. Okay, let's get started. So, in documenting Women's Wear Daily, since its debut in 1910, Women's Wear Daily evolved from a niche B2B business-to-business publication into a definitive record of the intersection of culture, commerce, and fashion. It is launched as a sister publication to the Daily News Record, or DNR, as some people may know it, and is a cornerstone of the Fairchild publishing empire. WWD was created to engage with the rapidly growing garment industry, as well as a new reader, which would be women, whose leisure time was spent carefully reading and understanding what to wear, how to wear, and engaging in sort of a social construct of the day in the early 1900s and into the really early 1920s. So the industry is a global, it's becoming a global commerce and it is transforming everything that we understand today about an industry. That industry particularly would be fashion. The document is originally founded by Edward W. Fairchild and Louis E. Fairchild, and would later be reshaped by Louis B. Fairchild, who understood the unique connection between fashion and business news. Under the leadership of his successor, who would be John B. Fairchild, which many people perhaps in your audience would know and contextualize WWD's voice around, Fairchild will change significantly how everyone reads WWD beginning in the 1960s when he arrives. He will expand its scope way beyond what we know it as a B2B, and embrace the broader cultural relevance that is fashion and the industry as it entered a new era of global influence. With over 160 years of coverage, this historic document is guided, by a bold declaration of its own purpose in its inaugural issue, and that is to say that Women's Wear Daily set out to cover the factors between the mill and the merchant. So that hopefully, sort of makes you consider how broad and how deep this research is, and how much coverage across 116 years, 365 days of the year, that is contextualized around fashion. So they would position themselves really as an interdisciplinary platform that connects pivotal social, political, and economic events with the evolution and connected to the evolution of the fashion industry. From documenting the impacts of world wars, presidential elections, to capturing the effects of tariffs, social upheavals, to milestones like the first moon landing, WWD has consistently explored how these historic events shape global commerce and cultural identity over time. For me, what in my research and really understanding this document, what continues to set WWD apart is its ability to contextualize historic social and political movements when they are culturally impactful, when that is in the moment. During the world wars, WWD delved into the effects of material rationing and the L-85 rulings that brought austerity to fashion, wartime policies, highlighting the shift toward pragmatism and resourcefulness in everyday life. In later decades, it would showcase how the civil rights movement, the rise of feminism and public protests, the Vietnam War, industry protests, and other moments that will profoundly reshape cultural norms. These moments are not simply reported as static events. Instead, WWD captured how grassroots movements, public advocacy, and creative expression would intersect to challenge existing power structures while influencing broader cultural and aesthetic dynamics. We can follow this storyline in similar articles like the one featured here, titled Woodstock in Washington, when 250,000 men of all ages protested the Vietnam War. That would be from all categories, from all levels of life, including, Broadway stars. We understand how important and the significance of not just Woodstock in the moment, but this change in the context of social voice and social protest would become. By connecting these historic events and their lasting implications, I think that continues to inform how WWD could wound fashion around the zeitgeist. From this point on, it will become a resource that can bridge disciplines, providing a nuanced lens on social change and its impact across not just fashion, but other industries as well: music, entertainment, art, politics, as you'll see as we, continue to discuss. When you consider the slide I have here, I can go back in time and see that, WWD was following politics very early on. Shirley Chisholm and her first bid for president, to Hillary Clinton's actual bid and success to run for president alongside Barack Obama's historic win. But along with these moments, they're also capturing how politics aligned in and with the fashion industry. So that, gives researchers or academics an understanding of how important this industry, which, many sometimes feels like it's fluffy, has such a global impact, a political impact, and WWD would always be at the forefront of those conversations. Beyond its industry focus, the publication interdisciplinary approach, I see it as it having demonstrated how activism and political moments shape public imagination, cultural innovation across time. This ability gives WWD foresight into self-expression, which cements its relevance not as a chronicler of the garment and fashion industry, but as a critical voice in understanding how transformative fashion is and how powerful fashion is and has become in the conversation of societal progress. Moving on to a case study is in the news right now, Saks Fifth Avenue evolution and restructuring. For Women's Wear Daily, having chronicled the retail environment for more than, since its like evolution in New York as an urban development, an urban city, Saks Fifth Avenue origins become quite important to how we first understand New York and understand luxury as retail in America, architecture in America, New York specifically, and what this transformation actually did to change everything that maybe I would know now today or anyone else walking up Fifth Avenue could understand. So it's at 1920 exactly that Saks Fifth Avenue will transform the corridor of Fifth Avenue into a premier luxury shopping district. In its early coverage, WWD, along with Saks, who takes out four pages in 1920, 4 pages again in 1924, to position themselves as an innovation, a leader in this moment that will change everything about shopping in America. They are credited with innovation, elevating uptown retail through specialization, the architectural prominence of the building alone, and their disciplined merchandising strategies, which will be contextualized in this coverage for the readers, for the business, for the actual readers of WWD, and helping themselves to distinguish themselves from where they had become, from a downtown department store to something that becomes a beneficiary of urban expansion. WWD will highlight how retail can marry prestige and commerce at scale. This is a narrative that fortified Saks as a business archetype for the luxury sector during its foundational years and many years to come. Over decades, WWD would capture Saks's milestones when it becomes a single flagship with an initial cost of $4 million. And then looking at the numbers that would total how it was paying rent, something that I think is always a big conversation in New York. But that would have been approximately like $35 million over 105 years. I think that makes that statement in 1920 solidifies Saks as a global powerhouse. Just that affordability, this luxury retail sector will come to America at a very pivotal time in the timeline of developing New York as an urban city. I think this trajectory also reflects shifting modalities of legacy retail. Saks will have to navigate many changes in consumer behavior. It will have ownership changes through the years and the competitive pressures of the ever-evolving fashion industry. Some of the important milestones that WWD will capture is when Saks gets a global investment of $1.5 billion from InvestCorp in 1990. This was because of our operational challenges as well as chargebacks that the business was facing. It also tested the brand's ability to sustain profitability with mounting costs and lots of leadership changes. For WWD, taking a headwind, I think, on Saks from the beginning allowed it to continue to elevate, tell this story across decades and to today. as we know, Saks, or many of you may know, Saks, the landmark acquisition of Saks into Neiman Marcus, or Neiman Marcus buying Saks, the entire global conversation around where this one legacy store will land is still something that WWD is following up to the minute today. There's a long arc of a critical inflection point beginning in January of this year when Saks announces a global bankruptcy. This will help researchers understand the evolution of retail as well as how this one store, like its counterparts, Macy's, Neiman Marcus, Nordstrom's, Bloomingdale's, Printemps, or the European retailers, and how it offers sort of a dynamic inroads to understanding retail from all angles of the business. When this happens, WWD will take the moment and see it as a reckoning and a reset, to shed light on what will become of retail in the future, a conversation that continues to be a part of the conversation that WWD is having. This allows us to sort of see it with the business intelligence of fashion alongside interdisciplinary coverage to provide readers with an assured confidence of the goings on and continuum of how the industry is evolving on every day and up to the minute. This business sector offers, a through line to the power of the business of fashion, not just from a fashion show perspective, but all the intricacies that make the business what it is today. Thank you. I'm going to pass it over to Chris now.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Tonya. Those were really compelling examples of how the content of the Women's Wear Daily Archive both documents but also inhabits trends in commercial, social, and political history.
Thank you.
And in a similar vein, I'd like now to offer another short use case that demonstrates how the Women's Wear Daily Archive can enable researchers to explore what might seem to be a quite focused and defined topic, but to take it across disciplines, to consider diverse aspects of not just fashion history, but other areas of visual culture and design. So the example here is the creative, aesthetic, and commercial influence of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, published in 1865. And this is a particularly powerful literary influence for fashion, as it conjures a vividly visual world defined by shifting scale, exaggerated form, and highly stylized characters. And these are qualities that make its imagery unusually adaptable, which helps to explain why these Alice-inspired aesthetics surface repeatedly within fashion and design scenarios documented by Women's Wear Daily. In 1923, Women's Wear Daily reports on a department store window display where literary characters appear in lifelike form, showing how Alice-related imagery is being incorporated into retail presentation. And here, Wonderland aesthetics function as a visual merchandising strategy used to attract attention, to create emotional engagement, and to drive consumer traffic. By 1947, Alice-inspired motifs are embedded in fashion marketing. Women's Wear Daily documents children's, girls, and teen wear promotions that are drawing on Wonderland imagery, translating the fantastic into silhouettes, trims, and themed collections aligned with post-war consumer demand. We see here literary aesthetics being adapted directly into commercial apparel strategy. In 1973, Alice-related references continue to appear within Women's Wear Daily as part of broader cultural and theatrical coverage, one of many such examples here across the decades. An Arts and Pleasures article discusses the staged production of Alice in Wonderland by the Manhattan Project in New York, directed by Andre Gregory, reflecting how fashion, performance, and cultural experimentation intersect. By 2024, at Cannes, designers are presenting fairy tale-themed looks for the Amphar Gala. Alice-associated aesthetics, such as the Queen of Hearts-inspired design on the right, surface again through luxury fashion, spectacle, and celebrity, and really demonstrate how these visual codes are continuing to circulate in high-end design environments. So we can see how, across more than a century of Women's Wear Daily coverage, Alice-inspired aesthetics appear as a recurring visual resource, activated right across retail, fashion marketing, entertainment, and live performance. And all of this underscores the value of being able to explore the full extent of this deep historical archive. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Tonya to present the last of her 3 research use cases.
Thank you, Chris. Alice is always fascinating to me. I was so excited to see that conversation, over time. That's what I think becomes so fascinating about Women's Wear Daily's deep breadth of knowledge and coverage across, industry and trends. For this last case study, I would like to discuss Josephine Baker and the intersection of arts, culture, and fashion through WWD's document. During the early 20th century, Women's Wear Daily emerged as a pivotal voice in documenting the evolving relationship between fashion, culture, and entertainment. Beyond its role as a leading authority on the fashion industry, WWD has a front row seat to the arts and entertainment community of every decade. In the 1920s, the publication would introduce the nightclub, the amusement section, and they are wearing. Something we might know today as street style. WWD would, trademark that in 1922. These are precursors to its later eye pages, which live in the paper today. In the amusements column, a similar review case to Daily Variety, which was launched in 1933. Women's Wear Daily would offer in-depth insight and reviews on analysis on film, TV, and media, capturing key cultural moments and people in the timeline. Against this backdrop, one of its most notable focuses became Josephine Baker, the legendary performer whose influence transcended the stage and deeply shaped global fashion and culture. Now, Josephine Baker, as a query, for me as an academic and as a researcher, lived in a moment, right? I have the pleasure of co-authoring WWD's Black in Fashion, where to even start a conversation, who would have been those influencers? We look back to Josephine and see her prominence through WWD's coverage as early as the minute she goes to from St. Louis to Paris, but even before then, where she's caught in the background of a really famous all-Black theater performance called The Chocolate Dandies. WWD will share insight that it sort of becomes a predictor of how they watch stage, screen, celebrity across time. For Josephine, it was just a short denotation that, hey, this play is great, but there is this one performer that everyone should probably think about and pay attention to. Her name is Josephine Baker. Her comedic display and her comedic, showing was something that WWD found quite interesting. A year later or two, she's going to go to Paris. And from there, WWD will watch Josephine. They see her as an influence. She's wearing designer dresses. She will be someone who I think becomes a major influence in understanding of the insight and the power of celebrity branding. Nothing that Josephine did was a haphazard conversation for herself or her audience. It's something that she, I believe, picked up on very early. And Women's Wear Daily shared the same enthusiasm for her stage presence, for her dress, her style. She will be someone they conversate with from the beginning until today. She's still quite an inspiration. She will emerge during the Jazz Age, the Harlem Renaissance, and become an icon of modernity and change. Her journey from vaudeville roots to her meteoric rise really set her up as a beacon of Black artistry, glamour, and innovation. As a cultural muse, WWD will speak to Josephine, I think, in very rare, intimate conversations like this one. Here, Baker's back again. This is 1973, and it will be right before one of her last performances in New York. She will talk to WWD about her style, about her hair, her spit curls, her ponytails, her lipstick, her wardrobe choices, including Moroccan style turbans and a handkerchief bearing her likeness during the Paris Expositions in the 1920s, alongside something that I found to be quite interesting as early as 1926, when Josephine Creole Tint is the name of a hosiery that bears her likeness, her skin color, which it's a very poignant moment, and it's a very specific moment in WWD's coverage of Josephine. And it was also, quite honestly, a surprise to me that Josephine had all this branding behind her, not something that we would normally understand about her in coverage that I've read in the media, or not. It's not as personal and collectively connected to Josephine in this way. That I think WWD brilliantly adds to the conversation that is fashion and fashion's history. Josephine would have been dressed by the best. There was materials, fabrics made for her just to perform. And milliners and dressmakers are frequently, drawn to her for inspiration. Yet much of that influence, we evoke Josephine through the banana skirt and the image that has become, a very prominent part of her legacy. But with Women's Wear Daily's focus on her, it highlights how she was a transformative force beyond shaping celebrity branding. She shaped beauty aesthetics, even in the midst of controversy that surrounded her name. So when considering knowledge and commercial imagery, she is a particular opportunity to see WWD's breadth of knowledge in the way that they're, using a sort of an open lens to capture inclusivity, diversity, and influence across time. Josephine's sartorial, impact will symbolize cultural shifts. It's very easy to watch it and then see other innovators like Lena Horne or Carmen de Lavalade and Eartha Kitt and all these people sort of enter this conversation very naturally through performance and through stage presence, which is one way that WWD explores fashion on, from a global, really and larger breadth of information. So with Baker's story, I believe there's a privilege to the content that WWD likes to draw on to amplify, the questions that sort of reside in conversations around unconventional people, the norms of the day, and how these individuals sort of help to disband discourse on identity and representation. So celebrating Josephine as a trailblazer is a way of seeing her from a different lens, from a lens that would not always be seemingly obvious, but not obvious at the same time. And I think this serves as a lasting testament to the power of WWD's content, the power of the artists, respecting their lens and the artist's lens at the same time to reimagine cultural narratives in research and academic spaces. Thank you. I'll pass it over to Chris.
Well, thank you again, Tonya. That was another really absorbing case study, and I think it really underlined the extent to which fashion history is pushing into adjacent fields and how fashion sources are valuable for interpreting topics across arts, entertainment, and other areas. But I think the same can be true in the opposite direction as well. So sources from outside of the fashion world per se can also disclose the extent and the versatility of fashion's influence and just how porous that boundary can be between disciplines. So I'd like to show briefly how to expand outward from fashion and retail into the wider creative economy, we can look across a broader set of disciplines and sources, again using the Alice theme. So first we can orient the research by starting with the Alice's Adventures in Wonderland topic page in ProQuest One literature, which situates the work through the original text alongside criticism, reference sources, and related scholarship. From there, we see how Alice moves into marketing and fashion promotion as captured in Women's Wear Daily. In 1951, Disney transforms Alice into animation by amplifying its aesthetic language. So bold color, stylized costuming, distorted scale, and highly recognizable characters establish this sort of shared reference that extends beyond film. A contemporaneous article from Kinematograph Weekly, available in ProQuest One Entertainment and Popular Culture, captures Walt Disney discussing how Carol's world was adapted into this animated form, illustrating how literary aesthetics are translated into mass entertainment and global visual culture. And jumping ahead several decades and across media, in 2015, the Royal National Theatre reimagines Alice through contemporary stage design in Wonderland, which can be viewed in ProQuest One Performing Arts. This production blends fashion, music, digital projection, and performance, and demonstrates how Wonderland continues to inspire this sort of immersive visual world. And looking across these resources allows us to trace how Alice in Wonderland still circulates through creative and commercial systems. And these connections only become fully visible when literature, fashion trade press, entertainment media, and performance records are viewed together, revealing this full life cycle of the cultural aesthetic. And on that note, I would like briefly to connect what you've seen today to how libraries are accessing this material. So the Women's Wear Daily archive is available through Fashion Studies collection in ProQuest One Visual Arts and Design. Or you'll find other key magazines from Penske covering the fashion trade with Daily News Record and Footwear News, and the Contemporary Art World with Art Forum. These are found alongside essential archival titles from other publishers in fashion, art and design, such as Vogue, Harper's Bazaar and House Beautiful. In ProQuest One Entertainment and Popular Culture, there are more archival runs of leading titles from Penske, covering film, television, music, and the wider entertainment industry, alongside hundreds more from other publishers. You can see some of the key titles from Penske here, such as The Hollywood Reporter, Variety, and Rolling Stone, all with deep back files dating back many decades. Additionally, both ProQuest One Visual Arts and Design and ProQuest One Entertainment and Popular Culture form part of ProQuest Digital Collections, a larger cross-disciplinary ProQuest Primary Sources subscription. And I'd add also that we've recently expanded access through our continued partnership with Penske Media by making available the Daily Variety Archive, which, as of last month, is available through ProQuest One Entertainment and Popular Culture, providing a vast and indispensable record for the film and entertainment industries from the 1930s forward. And I think we've seen how bringing together cross-disciplinary perspectives and a range of sources can only help to reveal the multifaceted quality of topics in fashion, media, arts and entertainment. And with that, we'd love to move on to questions. We have a few minutes for Q&A, so please feel free to ask any questions you have in the chat. And any we can't get through today, we can look to follow up after the session. But I see we have already got some questions. Most of them seemingly quite rightly for Tonya. So I'd like to ask to begin with. So it's interesting in itself that Women's Wear Daily was covering events like wartime rationing and civil rights. But would you be able to say a little bit more about how its perspective and its voice on this type of events it differs from more mainstream news coverage?
I think well, for women's wear as business intelligence, really, you have to we have to consider its focus on a industry, one specific one, that would be fashion. But in their coverage, they are looking beyond what fashion is, what affects fashion, and how really many of these moments in our life, in the timeline of how we understand history across the globe, dually affect this business that is fashion. In like World War II, I think I mentioned like looking at the L85 utility scheme rulings that limited the use of skirt lengths to fabric fullness. WWD would engage that conversation very early on since World War One, where you see these changes happening across time. So one looking at this from an academic research or personal, just informing self-knowledge, you can see Women's Wear Daily's coverage as a catalyst to understanding what actually was happening in a timeline. While we wonder that, oh, rationing meant people didn't spend money, that would sometimes be the complete opposite. As you continue to research their coverage of the timeline, there's also the timeliness of what's critical to empowering human conversation and engagement. I think what stands out to me is their coverage, particularly in the spaces of protest and war and civil rights movement, up until we have, the LGBTQ rights movement, Black empowerment, Black Lives Matter. When we approach Black in fashion, the one thing that you think about your own personal knowledge, but I think assumption is always going to be something you need to question about what you understand. From WWD, considering it from its visual attributes and its documentation. One thing that you can see early on is this idea of respectability, politics, and dress. Where is the acknowledgement of a community? WWD will go as far as visual display to help their reader understand what was actually happening in this timeline. The same would go for one of the earliest disasters in the American fashion industry, which would be the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, and how WWD would contextualize this very differently from someone like a New York Times or even a Vogue per se, because it's not just it's not really an editorial space. It really is about business intelligence, interdisciplinary coverage to highlight these intersections of consumer engagement.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Tonya, for the sort of detailed reply. A couple of other questions that come into the chat. Um, you talked about how coverage of Josephine Baker's life and career had been shaped by social and cultural changes. Um, do you see any differences in the type of coverage she gets at different times due to changes at Women's Wear Daily itself, in terms of its editorial priorities and its outlook?
Someone like Josephine Baker in the conversation that is fashion will always relate back to inspiration, right? She is an inspiration across time. As recently as, I believe, 2013, 2015, when Dior, Maria Grazia will do an entire show dedicated to her. So, you can see where she's on the stage, there's a political conversation, it's sort of like an ebb and flow, and I see Josephine as someone that becomes a discovery for many of readers, as was myself when we did Black in Fashion, and how you can see something like Women's Wear, a document like this, set researchers up to have a different conversation on her influence through time. She wasn't just a stage presence, but like I said, an early predecessor to what we understand as influencers today. Josephine is like the ultimate influencer, and her longevity stands to tell that narrative, across decades and across time. Um, and it, really helps to connect WWD's power of authority in the intersection of fashion, business, culture, and entertainment.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much. A few more questions I see in the chat. Again, I think this is one for you, Tonya.
Okay.
So thinking of a student audience, for example, later year undergraduates and new postgraduates who may be unfamiliar, um, to explain how retaining the name WWD is important despite its evolution into a product with broad coverage, both historic and very current, across the whole industry and interdisciplinary practice. What tips would you share for academics introducing WWD and its value as a key source and resource for study and research?
I would respond to that by saying, as a someone who teaches myself, I think the broader conversation is meeting students in the moment that they are. Take, for instance, Saks Fifth Avenue. It sets up a really great case study for retail evolution, watching such a big, dynamic entity like Saks Fifth Avenue go through a real like sort of change and their change will also is also evolving the question around what retail is. So I always say to me, a new student, in the moment that they're in, to contextualize bringing them into the historic foundation of a brand, especially when they're looking at brand identity, brand entity, brand longevity, heritage, to understand how Saks got to here. WWD is like a blueprint. It helps you to create a blueprint to show a student, to help a researcher see their timeline, throughout from the foundation to the moment they're in today. And I think that's how I would approach that always.
Well, that's great. And yes, that certainly sounds persuasive to me. Um, there's a question here that I think I can answer. Um, are there any specialized filters for searching in this resource? Specifically, could I search just for images or just for advertisements? Um,
Mhm.
Additionally, is there a point where the material shifts to text only, or is everything full page like what has been shown here? Um, regarding the specialist filters, article records do tag both the type of document, whether that be advertisement, beauty, runway, front page. So you can isolate the type of document that you're interested in, or indeed features contained within that document, such as illustrations, photographs, diagrams, tables. Um, so there are quite sophisticated ways of narrowing down to particular content of interest. Um, hope that answers the question. Regarding does the material in the archive shift to text only? No, in the Women's Wear Daily Archive, it's all full page image and cover to cover page images. Um, um, and that's consistent through issue one up to the most recent issues and the ongoing um, new issue editions. Um, so I think that
Would you mind if I
answers that
add
one.
to that?
Of course.
Yeah. As Chris was saying, when you think about a publication like Women's Wear Daily, I think, yes, very early on, it's lots of text, but it's also very illustrated. It's heavy on illustration. It's known. It is actually known for the dialogue it has with the fashion illustrator and advertisement. And I think, as Chris was saying, you can see that evolution. You can see the evolution from the beginning to where we stand today as a digital narrative, where someone who doesn't, you're new to fashion or you're new to this sort of document, and all the documents that would be contextualized as early as the 1900, early 1900s. They're mostly text. There's a lot of text, but fashion and music and arts, that evolution you could see it through time and how where illustration stops and where photography takes over is very prominent, in the way that the paper itself will evolve.
Okay, some of the other questions have come in. Um, this is one that I think I certainly need to defer to Tonya on. Um, I find WWD helpful in researching the impact of designers who are underrepresented in publishing, i.e., no books being published on them. Do our presenters have a favorite designer who they would love to see covered in a published retrospective?
Do I have any that I would like to see?
I think that's the question, yeah.
Oh, I have a ton. There are tons. Um, They cross boundaries. They're not just fashion designers, they are shoemakers, there are accessories designers, there are menswear designers, there's the WWD moving from its women's wear to Women's Wear Daily to WWD. That entity that is this document is everything that if you want to see this intersection, or what I always call the trilogy of art, fashion, entertainment, just the zeitgeist. If you want to see it evolving, you can look to this document to find so many the name designers, of course, but also the ones that sat in the timeline with the same designers that got the same coverage, but today are not in the conversation. It's very similar to how we approached Black in fashion, to understand where those creators were and who were they, as an understanding of what you might be wanting to offer a student body, or do in your own research. Yeah, of course there are many. I can't even tell you. My list is quite long. There are costume designers in here that I never heard of. There are moments that, yeah, they sit to understand the power of this document. Yeah, it's very refreshing to know that Women's Wear Daily, alongside many of the PMC um, holdings, the documents are powerful. They embrace them, they embrace what they focused on, and they, really ascend beyond what we understand in the coverage today. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Another question that I absolutely love here, and I think some of that has sort of been addressed through the case studies, I would imagine. But how do you discuss fashion with someone who believes it doesn't matter? It's just clothes.
Okay. So I think, yeah, we did address some of that. When you look at Alice in Wonderland, right? Remember, I think thinking about how that stands to say how we are interested in something that we think is not important, today becomes a really hot button question. It's, always at the top of mind for researchers and academics in this field, as well as people who now come from outside of the field to understand the power of fashion, from psychological aspects, sociology, social anthropology. It is, you wear it, we wear it every day. I always say this to a student body, a cohort that have the privilege to, present this work to. I say, think about the one simplest thing in your wardrobe is like a t-shirt. The one thing that democratized fashion, the thing similar to denim, where something that is democratized. Everybody wears this every day. But yet, and still, I don't think we understand the power of what self-representation, self-expression is, and the simplest thing, the things that, are considered what fast fashion is today. And I would say to someone who's not interested in fashion, then I would say, why don't you wrap yourself around what you think it didn't have anything to do with? That would be the politics of things, the economics of every day, the makers, the craftsmanship, the dedicated labor that is still a very huge part of why an industry like fashion still matters today in the global economy.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that's again very persuasive on that point. Um, and yeah,
Yeah.
I'm convinced.
Okay, good.
Another question I saw come in. Um, um, yes, so you talked about how WWD presents Josephine Baker as polished and deliberate, um, rather than the one-dimensional image many students recognize. Um, how do you find students react when that familiar icon's revealed in that way?
I think they react the same way I did. I was
Mm,
quite surprised. I understand Josephine Baker in the construct of that one-dimensional idea of her very early on in my own studies to be privileged, really, to have insight into this document, to have the opportunity to use my mind is like a rabbit hole, and I like to go down it and figure out, well, what else? Well, what did Josephine mean to this document? Did they have to cover her? No, but they did. And the way that they saw her, it was as surprising to me, I think, as it would to be to any student, understanding contributions from the Black community or contributions from entertainment across culture. Um, there are so many people beyond Josephine that their impact, I think, we don't yet understand. Josephine would be one of those many people. To see Josephine as a catalyst for to me, when I see when I know what I know today, well, yeah, this is how we have Rihanna. I think of her that way, right? I think of social influencers today, and the making of that, the idea of someone setting themselves up to have a legacy that Josephine has. Had I not had this opportunity, um, I don't think I would have known those things about Josephine, to be quite honest. Um, and every time I think about just the discovery of that, it just, really excites me about what else does Women's Wear Daily have? These publications they've been around for more than 100 years. So 365 days a year, you could just imagine, how in depth the coverage it really is. Yeah.
yeah, it's intriguing, isn't it? Yeah, I certainly feel like I've only scratched the surface.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for the response. I think we're approaching time there, and I would like to give Sabrina an opportunity to wrap up the session in a moment. But just to say thank you again to everyone for attending and for the thoughtful questions and discussion. Um, Thank you again, Tonya, for giving us the benefit of your perspective today and sharing
Thank you.
your really fascinating work.
Thank you.
Um, I did just want to note that if you're interested in learning more about access to the Women's Wear Daily Archive, the Daily Variety Archive, or any of the other titles that we've discussed today, the Clarivate team would be happy to follow up. So you can reach out to us directly or connect with your Clarivate representative for additional information. But with that, I'll hand things back to Sabrina to close us out on behalf of ACRL and Choice, including next steps and follow-up information. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Chris. Yeah, I'll just say thank you to Tonya and Chris for taking the time to speak with us today. And thank you to our attendees for your questions and your comments. I'd like to remind our viewers that we did record today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from Choice with links to the recording and today's slides. Also, if you have a few minutes after the presentation to fill out a brief survey, we would really appreciate it. So thanks again to all of you out there for joining us. We hope you learned something new from the webinar and hope to see you again soon on another session.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.